please take your seats. We're going to start just in a minute. I know there are some people here who haven't been here the last 2 mornings, and I just want to take a minute to explain this new feature in our 10th anniversary of the Aspen Ideas Festival, Aspen Lectures. Most of you know that most of what we do here, not just at the Ideas Festival, but for other public programs, tend to be moderated conversations. And many of our guests have said over the years that they wish they had an opportunity to hear in more depth from some of our most outstanding speakers, to have a deeper and longer dive in a critical issue. So we asked 6 extraordinary people to give what we're going to brand as Aspen Lectures. And we're going to call them Aspen Lectures, distribute them as Aspen Lectures, so they're going to have a very wide life, not just here at the festival. This morning, I'm delighted to introduce Robert Reich, who's the Chancellor's Professor of Public Policy at Berkeley. Of course, he's familiar to everyone for many other reasons. He's written, I think, 13 books, the most recently Aftershock, The Next Economy, and the America's Future. He, of course, he served in 3 presidential administrations. He was the Secretary of Labor for President Clinton. He also recently was the guiding spirit of a remarkable documentary called Inequality for All. As a matter of fact, we showed it right here in this room last year. I think it may have only been the 2nd showing before its broad release. It won a distinguished prize at Sundance. He's also the founder of the American Prospect. He's the head of Common Cause. He's absolutely terrific. We're thrilled to have him here. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Reich.
Well, Elliot, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming this morning. As you can see, the economy has worn me down. I want to talk to you about the economy. I also want to talk to you about politics and a little bit about sociology and ethics as well, because they really can't be separated. The notion of economics as a separate discipline really comes in 1890 when Alfred Marshall, the great economist, wrote his Principles of Economics. Before then, in the 19th century, it was political economy. People talked about political economy. They saw the relationship between politics and economics. It was impossible to talk about one without the other. And if you go back even further in time, in the 18th century, well, it wasn't even political economy. Adam Smith called himself not a political economist, but a moral philosopher. In the 18th century, the question addressed by people who were otherwise, or today, were assumed to be doing economics or politics, was really a fundamental question that I want to talk about today, and that is, what is a good society? What are the hallmarks of a good society? How do we define a good society? The debate over inequality is a hard debate, and it's becoming harder almost all the time. I've been working and writing, and occasionally I've had administrative positions and working on this issue. It's hard because regardless of how you interpret the facts, you have to come to the conclusion that inequality is widening in the United States and almost every other country. The United States is a little bit of an outlier. The inequality is wider here than it is elsewhere. But it's also a difficult thing to talk about because many people understand the issue and frame the issue as a zero-sum game in which either some people, the wealthy, gain, or the middle class and the poor gain, that there's some sort of trade-off between the two. That's not necessarily the fact, and I will get into that in more detail in a moment. The other part that's difficult about this conversation is that implicitly, some people in talking about inequality are understood to be blaming others, whether it's blaming the poor or blaming the rich, or blaming immigrants, or blaming anyone else. There's a lot of blame going on. And if you really understand the contours of the issue, it is not about blame at all. It's about how we have organized ourselves in this political economy with regard to a certain set of objectives having to do with how we define a good society. So rather than get in the blame game, and also rather than get in the zero-sum kind of mentality, I would like to go on for a little bit talking about what the issue is all about and what we might do about it, and then open it up for your questions. Okay? Good. If you said no, I don't know what I'd do. First of all, the first thing that you need to understand, everybody needs to understand, is that some amount of inequality is necessary and inevitable. We're not all born with equal endowments, and any economy, if it's going to have the right incentives for people to work hard and save and invest and innovate, is going to have some degree of inequality in terms of what people are paid. You can't expect that people are going to make those kinds of efforts without there being some reward at the end. So the issue really is not inequality or not inequality. The issue is very different. The issue we are debating today, and Thomas Piketty's book really crystallized the issue for many people. When I say Thomas Piketty, some people say, well, it's Thomas Piketty. Well, I actually had a chance to talk with him a couple of months ago, and I said, Thomas, and I started a question. He said, no, call me Tom. So I'm going to say Thomas Piketty. He crystallized for many of us a fundamental question, not so much about equality or non-equality. The question is, when does equality become so wide that it threatens a lot of things that we all hold in common? The economy, equal opportunity, and even the coherence of a society. And are we getting to that tipping point? The economy is not doing terribly well in the United States. I don't know whether I need to tell you that. If you are mainly dependent on the stock market, it's doing pretty well. But if you are mainly dependent on jobs and wages, it is not doing terribly well. Most Americans right now are not experiencing a recovery as we normally define a recovery. It is true that we are back to the same number of jobs we had before the crash of 2008, but we've got 15,000 more people of working age who need and want jobs. So we're not actually back to where we were. We can't go back to where we were. We need to have many more jobs. We also know that the median wage is actually falling. The last 12 months, median wages, weekly earnings have dropped. And I want to make sure that you all understand, that I understand that you understand, the difference between average and median. Average wages are going up, but the median isn't. The median is going down. How can that be? Well, the basketball player Shaquille O'Neal and I have an average height of 6'2". Do you get my drift? You see, averages can be pulled up by people at the top. What you really want to look at is the people smack in the middle, half above, half below. And what we've seen, and this is not new, this has been going on for years, we've seen is that the median wage, whether it's hourly or salary, median wage has been going nowhere. Adjusted for inflation, it's been going nowhere for quite some time. Now, people have slightly different critiques of different models and different data sources, and even Thomas Piketty, has been criticized with regard to some of his data sources, but generally there is widespread agreement that median wages in the United States have gone basically nowhere, particularly if you are a male worker dependent on hourly wages. In fact, the real mystery for so many of us so long was how can American consumers keep on buying when wages are going nowhere. You know, for years, the American consumer was the Energizer bunny of the global economy. Kept on buying and buying and buying and buying, even though those of us who were looking at the data saw wages and even benefits shrinking and wages going nowhere. And so the question, where is the money coming from? How can consumers keep going? And this really began in the late 1970s, this leveling off of wages, even though the economy kept on growing. In fact, today the economy is more than twice as large as it was in 1980. But median wages, adjusted for inflation, almost where they were. The answer to that puzzle, how can people keep on spending even though wages are going nowhere? The answer to that puzzle is very simple. Number one, when male wages started declining, women, particularly young wives and mothers, streamed into the workforce, starting in the late 1970s, continuing in the 80s, continuing in the 90s, a real social revolution. We didn't talk about it as such at the time. I was one of those who thought it was due to all of the wonderful professional opportunities open to women. Well, that was part of it, but the major reason wives and mothers streamed into the workforce, paid workforce, they've been working, obviously, and poor women have been working right through, but the main reason that middle class and lower middle class wives and mothers streamed into the workforce was to prop up family incomes because male wages were starting to falter. And when that coping mechanism was exhausted, people turned to a second coping mechanism in the 1990s. When I was Secretary of Labor, I was amazed at how many hours people were putting in at work. Billable hours if they were professionals, overtime if they were not professionals, hourly workers. Everybody was working extraordinary amounts. In fact, very often in the same family, you had husbands and wives, partners, who were doing shifts. They were passing each other. They were working 12-hour shifts at more than 2 jobs. I had an acronym for these families. I called them DINS, D-I-N-S, double income, no sex. Because I didn't know, how did we procreate in the 1990s? I don't know. But when that coping mechanism, that is working more hours, was exhausted, because there's only a number of hours that you can work, we turned to a third coping mechanism to deal with flat or declining real wages. And that third coping mechanism was turning our homes into piggy banks and basically refinancing them or getting loans based on the home's collateral value. And we did that for a number of years. And home values, everybody thought, would keep on going up. And then, of course, we had the housing bubble and the debt bubble exploding in 2008. So one reason that inequality, or at least stagnant wages and the question of where's all the money going, has become so salient is because all of those coping mechanisms are now exhausted. If those coping mechanisms are exhausted, the economy is not going to grow because the middle class and the poor no longer have the purchasing power to keep the economy going. Latest figures show that the best estimates for economic growth this year are about 2% annualized. Now, that may sound pretty good to you, but let me tell you, it's not. In fact, when we have suffered, as we did, a great national recession, second only to the Great Depression, what you expect and what you want in the years following that huge economic collapse is very large economic growth per year to get us back on the track we were on. That's what happened in the Great Depression. We had very fast and very large growth in 1934, 1935, 1936. 2% annualized growth per year now doesn't get us anywhere. In fact, the latest data out of the Commerce Department actually show that in the first quarter of this year, the economy contracted. Now, I think a lot of that is because of weather, but it's not just weather. It's that 70% of the economy is based on consumer spending, consumer activity. And if you've got so many people who can't spend, and they can't borrow, and we don't want them to go back into a borrowing binge like we had before. We saw what happened then. If they can't borrow, they can't spend, they don't have adequate wages, they are caught in basically living from paycheck to paycheck, then the economy as a whole is not going to grow. They don't have the purchasing power to enable the economy to grow. 65% of Americans right now are living paycheck to paycheck. There's a lot of insecurity out there. So one of the problems with widening inequality, that is stagnant paychecks, stagnant wages for the vast majority, median wages going nowhere, most of the economic gains going to the very top, is that you've got an economy that cannot function. There is not enough purchasing power in the economy to enable it to function. And that is the story of our time right now, post-coping mechanisms. So, quite apart from issues of fairness, there is just a basic economic issue. How do we get the economy going if the middle class, the great middle class, and the poor don't have the ability to buy what's needed? Sometimes when I talk about this issue of buying, some people get a little bit nervous. Well, aren't we buying too much? Aren't we filling our houses with too much stuff? We can't afford this environmentally. Isn't this not sustainable? When I talk about consumption, I'm talking broadly about not just material goods, I'm talking about everything. Health, public health, education, the general infrastructure of the country. Some of them are public goods, some of them are private goods. We're talking about utilizing the productive capacities of the country. And we're not going to utilize the productive capacities of the country if we don't have a large and growing and buoyant middle class. So point number one, why we are concerned about widening inequality is just a basic pedestrian issue, and that is the economy cannot get out of the doldrums, and we cannot promise our children a better life. And we'll come back to this. By the way, I should say, just summarizing this first point, and this gets back to my point about it not being a zero-sum contest, the wealthy in this country would do better with a smaller share of a rapidly growing economy than a large share of an economy that is not growing. It's basically dead in the tracks. This is not a zero-sum game, folks. Point number two, why are we concerned about widening inequality? Are we getting to a tipping point right now? Point number two has to do with upward mobility, what happens to the poor, and our ideal of equal opportunity. Now, there are some people who, looking at this inequality debate, have concluded that we shouldn't be even talking about inequality. It conjures up envy and resentment and class, and we ought to just pay attention to the problems of the poor. If we're really concerned about upward mobility and equal opportunity, let's just look at the problems of the poor and make sure that they have upward mobility and equal opportunity. And that sounds sensible on the surface. Here is where it is naive and nonsensical. If you don't have a growing and buoyant middle class, the poor cannot ascend into it. A shrinking middle class makes it harder for people who are not yet in the middle class to join it. It is only when you have a large and buoyant and growing middle class that there is the possibility of ascending into the middle class. And also, the middle class is going to be less generous to those in need because the middle class is so insecure. You have a harder time getting a political coalition. And here's where I want to emphasize the connections between politics and economics. You have a hard time getting a political coalition in favor of helping the poor with getting the right schools and the right resources and the right social programs if the middle class is scared and itself feels like it doesn't have its own capacity to make sure that its own children and its own neighbors and friends are moving upward. And thirdly, with regard to why you can't separate the problems of equal opportunity from upward mobility is this. We know that in the United States, 42% of children born into poverty will never get out of poverty. That is the highest percentage of any industrial country, any rich country. Even if you go to England, Britain, Great Britain, where you have a tradition of aristocracy, you've got only 30% of children born into poverty will never get out of poverty as adults. Now, there's something bizarre about the United States, the land of equal opportunity, having 42% of our kids never getting out of poverty. One of the problems for so many who are in poverty has to do with the geographic concentration of poverty, the fact that there is no longer the ladders into the middle class. Research has shown that upward mobility, that is the speed and velocity by which somebody moves up into the middle class or even from the middle class to the rich, has not really declined over the last 15 or 20 years. But if the ladder is much longer, the ladder separating the poor from the middle class from the rich. If it's just a much longer ladder, even if you are moving up the ladder at the same speed and velocity you were moving up before, you're not going to get as far. And if you add to that the fact that there are certain middle rungs in the ladder that are now missing, they used to be called manufacturing jobs. They paid very well. You could get them even if you didn't have much education, and they were good unionized jobs. Those are gone. So you have now a longer ladder, and you have rungs in the middle of the ladder that are gone. Well, you can see logically why so many of our poor have a problem ascending into the middle class. In other words, you can't separate the issues of widening inequality from the issues of the poor, upward mobility, and equal opportunity. The other thing to keep in mind, education is so central to this question of equal opportunity and upward mobility. In the United States, we are one of three. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, did a study recently of what countries do with regard to spending per pupil on poor children from poor families and poor communities relative to rich and middle class children from middle class or poor or rich families in rich or middle class communities. And what the OECD found is that the United States is one of only 3 countries out of 34 countries they studied, all of them advanced rich countries or very rapidly developing countries. Only 3 countries that is spending less per pupil on poor kids than on middle class and rich kids. Now, if we're serious about upward mobility, equal opportunity, that to me is appalling. And you can connect the dots in terms of what I've said already about why a stressed and anxious middle class is unlikely to want to change all that very much. Third and finally, so number 1, the economy generally. Number 2, the poor, upward mobility, equal opportunity. The third major problem we are dealing with in terms of widening inequality has to do with our politics, our democracy. And here, again, it is difficult to talk about this without sounding as if one is blaming, and I am not blaming. What we know about politics and democracy is that political power follows the money. If you've got a lot of money in the hands of a few people at the top, inevitably, those people have more political power. Not because they're doing anything badly, but just because there are more opportunities for them to affect the political process, either directly or indirectly. As the great Justice Louis Brandeis said about 100 years ago, almost exactly 100 years ago, we have a choice. We can have great wealth in the hands of a few, or we can have a democracy. But we can't have both. There is another corollary to the problem of large money and large wealth infecting and undermining our democracy. And even if the Supreme Court in Citizens United and McCutcheon had not done what they did, we would still have this problem. And that is that political scientists see more inequality means more divisiveness politically. In fact, there's a direct correlation between the degree of inequality in a society and the degree of political polarization. Why is that? Well, nobody has come up with a good theory, but you can see the direct correlation. You had, in the 1920s, high inequality and high polarization. And then between the 50s, 60s, 70s, you had low inequality, much more political collaboration, not only formal among the parties, but also in the country at large. And then when inequality began to increase in the 80s, 90s, and now, high levels of inequality, much more polarization. My theory, and it's just a theory, is that what happens with high levels of inequality is that people are working harder than ever, and they begin to feel frustrated. They're not getting anywhere. In fact, they are worried, they're insecure. When people are frustrated and insecure economically, they also can get angry. And this is fodder for demagogues on the right or the left who want to use the politics of resentment to advance their own political agendas. And what we have in periods of high inequality, high frustration and anger, we have a politics of resentment where people, politicians, leaders, are pointing the finger of blame. If they are on the left, they're blaming the rich, and they're blaming corporations, and they're blaming various other forces. If they're on the right, they're blaming the government, and they're blaming the poor, and they're blaming immigrants. It goes back to the blame game that I was talking about initially. The irony is that I'm old enough to remember issues that really did cause the country to split. I mean, the civil rights movement was very, very hard for many people, particularly in the South, but many in the North as well. Vietnam and the Vietnam War. Go back to the communist witch hunts of Joe McCarthy and that era. I mean, we have had in this country issues that split us very powerfully, very dramatically. But right now, the level of vitriol and bitterness and anger and nastiness in politics is worse than I've ever seen it, and it's hard to come up with the kind of issue like the communist witch hunts or Vietnam or the civil rights movement or anything else that would justify or seem to explain this degree of vitriol. I think my explanation is really the easiest to comprehend. I think it is about the frustrations of so many people. I was on a television show not that long ago arguing with an economist who had been a chief economist for John McCain in the 2008 election. We were arguing, I don't know what we were arguing about, some economic issue, but it turns out we actually agreed more than we disagreed. He was very smart. And we got to the station break, a commercial break, and the director in my earbud came on, and I said, pretty good, huh? I mean, I thought I was feeling pretty proud of both of us for finding so many areas of agreement. And she said, no, be angrier. I said, I don't want to be angrier. I mean, I thought we're modeling what the country needs right now. She said, no, you got to be angry. I said, why? I don't want to be angry. She said, because you got hundreds of people, I mean, thousands, millions of people who are surfing through hundreds of television channels, and they will only stop when they see a gladiator contest, a kind of a bloodletting, a kind of mud wrestling. And I said, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. We agree. I don't want to be angry. She said, you have to. We're going back on the air in 10 seconds. I said, I don't want to be angry. She said, you have to. And at that point, I lost my temper. But I've thought about that instance since then, and I think that what the producer was really saying is that the country is so angry. There's so much anger out there that people do want to see in the media their anger replicated. There's something satisfying about that kind of angry response. And sometimes when I'm on MSNBC or on other channels or on radio stations, again, I'm aware that they are selling their channel and their commercial products through a thinly veiled layer of vitriol and anger and blame. Which gets me back to the issue of inequality overall and why it's so hard to talk about it. There are solutions, but in order to get to the solutions, we've got to get out of the blame game. We've got to understand that this is about how we are organized, how we've organized ourselves. I mentioned education. Education is a key. At the University of California, Berkeley, where I teach, one of the things I love about a public university is the diversity economically of my students. A third of my students are Pell Grant eligible. That means they're coming from very poor families. How did they get to the University of California, Berkeley? Well, they started at a community college. Community colleges are the great unsung heroes of our entire system of education. We need to do much more. It is absurd and an absurd conceit that the only way people can get into the middle class and have a good job is through a 4-year liberal arts or a 4-year college degree. That's not and should not be the case. Other countries, notably Germany, have excellent world-class systems of technical education. We need to do the same. Beyond that, we can alter a tax system. You know, people often don't remember, or they don't want to remember, that before 1981, from 1943 to 1981, the highest marginal income tax, that is the marginal income tax on highest income earners, was never below 70%. And even after all of the tax deductions and tax credits, even if you're looking at the effective rate, it hovered around 50 to 54%. Marginal, highest income earners. We can't even begin that discussion now. But if we're going to have great educational systems and a world-class infrastructure and all of the other things, the public goods that we need, now, I don't see any alternative given that the middle class is so stressed. The other thing that needs to happen, in my view, has to do with constraining Wall Street. Wall Street is indirectly culpable here, and that this is not, again, a matter of casting blame. Wall Street is playing by the rules, as Wall Street has helped craft those rules. But Wall Street's excesses leading up to 2008 did impose a huge burden on many of the most vulnerable members of our society. I know, and because I've talked to some of you, that some of the sessions here at Aspen at the Ideas Festival have looked at housing policy and have looked at many other attributes of the problems of the poor and the middle class in the wake of 2008. But unless we have some limits on the size of the biggest banks and also resurrect the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated investment from commercial banking, I'm afraid we are going to see a replication of what we've seen before. Nobody, no institution, no financial institution or any other institution should be too big to fail, period. Now, let me just say one final thing. When people ask me, what's the first step for dealing with widening inequality, the very first step, I take a page out of Larry Lessig's book. I think getting big money out of politics is critically important. I am chairman of an organization called Common Cause we have a Common Cause member here. I urge you all to join. It's an organization that has been battling this battle courageously and very, very well for many, many years, founded by a Republican, John Gardner, 43 years ago. But we've got to, in order to make any progress, we've got to make our democracy work and restore our democracy. My biggest fear is cynicism. A new poll put out by the Pew Foundation showed that 62% of Americans now believe that the game is rigged. In economic terms, the powerful are running the show. Even a majority of conservatives who are young, people who are under the age of 24 but call themselves conservatives, believe that the game is rigged, that there's too much power over the economy by a small group of people. Well, this can lead to change, but it can also lead to widespread cynicism about the capacity of our system to respond to the needs of our people. My students are very publicly spirited. But by the same token, when we talk about politics or them getting involved and engaged in politics, they basically hold their nose. And I tell them, if they are going to give up on politics, they are giving up on democracy. And if they're giving up on democracy, they are ceding the most valuable thing that we have to basically special and particular financial-based interests that do not have the public interest at heart. So political engagement is critical. Fighting cynicism is critical. I started by talking about the relationships between politics, economics, and ethics. This is fundamentally about what we mean by a good society. I am not a class warrior. I mean, Bill O'Reilly calls me a communist. I am not. I've never been a member of the Communist Party, I assure you, and I'm not a class warrior, but I am a class worrier, W-O-R-R. It's one letter, but it really is important. And I think everybody in this room, I hope, is also a class worrier, because everything we hold dear, our economy, equal opportunity, and our democracy, and the continuity and integrity of our country in terms of avoiding polarization are all at stake here. Thank you very much. So let me quickly go to your questions, because that's really my favorite thing. Yes. And I'll repeat the question. And by the way, if I don't have an answer, I'll repeat a question that I do have an answer for.
If the goal is the upward mobility, thank you. If the goal is mobility and to grow the middle class, and the country suffers from so much deferred maintenance by way of roads and bridges and schools and institutions, and on the other hand, you have so many that are unemployed or underemployed, why is it so difficult to marry those two for the obvious goals that you've enunciated?
Thank you. The question, I would add a third paradox, because you've got a lot of long-term unemployed, and you've got deferred maintenance, but you also have historically very low borrowing costs for the federal government. So if there was ever a time to get on with modernizing our infrastructure and hiring a lot of people and doing it as cheaply as we could ever do it, this is the time. And why is it not being done? It's a combination of gridlock in Washington and ideological opposition to government basically doing very much. That's the only answer I can give you. The peculiarity here with regard to infrastructure, I want to add a point, is that, and I don't want to be partisan about this, really, I don't. This is a nonpartisan issue, but Republicans have been the great champions of infrastructure for years. When I was in Washington and I wanted to work and push some jobs program, I stressed infrastructure, and I got more Republican support than I did Democratic support. I don't know what has happened. Some of you may have theories. Yes?
There are so many inflection points, so many areas to focus on. I prefer to focus on education. And yesterday I heard General McChrystal say that of all the people who enlist, try to enlist, 71% are turned down. So we have all these needs, whether it's the grid or other, I was going to say shovel-ready projects, but that's not the case. That's such a fundamental issue that 71% for various reasons cannot get into the military. I don't know if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, well, let me just say about education, we are caught, as we are in many other policy areas, in a polarized gridlock debate that doesn't have to be. On the one hand, you've got people who say the answer is to make teachers more responsible and provide more choice of school. On the other hand, you have people who say, no, it's all about more money and more resources in the classroom. It's actually about both. In other words, number one, if we want high-quality people to be teaching our kids, and the custodians of our human capital, to my mind, are as important, if not more important, than the investment bankers who are the custodians of our financial capital. We want high-quality, very talented people, men or women, to be teaching our kids. The law of supply and demand is not repealed at the classroom door. We've got to pay them. Now, we also want them to be accountable. And I think that teachers' unions and others who say we demand early tenure and we don't really want to be held accountable, they are wrong. If there are going to be more resources for teachers, if there are going to be more resources for classrooms, we also have to make sure that they are held accountable to certain performance standards. The second thing I want to say is that what's happening now in American education is we are training an entire generation of young people to take tests. Now, I am a product of the New York State Regents system. I took Regents exams once a year when I was in high school on a variety of subjects. I didn't feel that they intruded too much, but I think we may have gone way over the edge with regard to teaching. I go into classrooms, my sister is a public school teacher, I go into many public school classrooms, and what I find is teachers who are basically teaching how to succeed on taking tests. The economy is not a standardized test-taking economy. Once those students get out, they have to understand how to solve problems, identify problems, see patterns, work collaboratively with others. It is not about taking tests. We want to make sure that there's a minimum level of competence. But beyond that, we want people to be innovative and creative and collaborative. And I worry that our curricula are just completely now narrow and narrowly defined. Finally, just something about college and access to college. We have a notion in this country that we have problems at the primary and secondary levels, but that college is just fine. That is not true. We have some elite colleges that are doing extraordinarily well. They are among the best institutions in the world. But our typical college students are coming out of a primary and secondary system that are not training them adequately, and much of the first and second year of many universities and colleges is remedial. That should not be. Plus, we've got too many kids who go to college and basically fail and drop out. This is not rocket science, by the way. There are ways to deal with this. We're the richest nation in the world. Still, we should have the best educational system in the world. Yes.
You said that this isn't a zero-sum game. How do we reconcile, for the last 2 days we've heard that the middle class around the world is growing at an unprecedented rate. China has seen growth, improvement in living conditions that are unprecedented in history. Capital benefits from globalization. Our U.S. labor does not. How do we reconcile the improvement in the economies or the middle class around the world with what's happening in the U.S.?
Well, first of all, globalization does not have to be part of a zero-sum game either. That is, traditionally, and this is especially true since the Kennedy round of global trade opening agreements, we have seen that as other countries get richer, we also get richer. We have more access to cheaper products and better products. What the failing here goes back to education, and it goes back to the ability we have to develop our human capital. That is, it should not be that we are competing with low-wage nations. I mean, Germany, again, has a higher median wage than we do, but Germany is a major exporter, and it still has precision manufacturing, has a lot of good jobs. Just to carry the notion forward, years ago, I had my hips replaced. They're beautiful hips. I can't show them to you, but they are beautiful. Have to take my word for them. But I was talking about this issue of zero-sum and international labor, and I went back to the hospital where my hips were made and discovered that my beautiful new hips were actually fabricated in Germany, not in Bangladesh, not in Southeast Asia, in Germany. Why? Because the value added, the productivity, and the precision manufacturing there was worth the high wages. That's where we also need to be. I should add that my hips were designed in France. I have French designer hips. But you get my point. Many times we get into this notion that we've got to take the low road to lower wages or to lower regulations or to that the zero-sum game is propelling us in that direction. It need not propel us in that direction. I just want to get, we have just 5 minutes remaining, and I want to get some female questions, some women. Yes.
I'd like to ask you about education. It always strikes me when I come to the United States that we educate people for jobs and not for self-employment. Jobs are disappearing, and I think the lessons to be learned come from some of the earlier immigrants who, for one reason or another, weren't able to get the jobs that were available, and so started small micro businesses. And I think the lesson now comes from women who, because of their dual responsibilities, can't fit into the getting on job paths. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, the data are not clear on the number of small business formations. A lot of independent contractors who are basically involuntarily laid off and have to become independent contractors because that's the only way they can earn money, are classified as small businesses. So we don't know exactly how much genuine entrepreneurial small business activity is going on. But having said that, I think you're absolutely right. We need to educate people not only to be entrepreneurs, but we need to educate people to be full citizens. Education is not just about the economy or just about jobs. We used to think about higher education, for example, as a public good, not a private investment. And our whole focus, given the economic straitjacket that so much of the middle class feels itself in, has been on education as an avenue for great jobs. But I agree with you. Your basic point, yes, we need to educate more broadly for people to take an entrepreneurial role. But you remind me of one other point, quickly. There is a wave of technology coming at us. And undoubtedly, that means there will be, and a lot of these technologies are labor-replacing technologies. About 4 weeks ago, the chairman of one of the largest high-tech companies in America came into my office and said he was worried about widening inequality. And we talked about it, and finally, at the end of the hour and a half, I said, "Why are you so concerned?" He said, "Because I'm afraid, given the trajectory that I see, that my consumer base that is still very much American is just not going to be able to afford my products in the future. Getting back to the point I made before. I don't think technology is going to take away jobs per se. What it's going to do is push more and more Americans into the local service economy. Retail, restaurant, hotel, hospital, surface transportation, childcare, elder care, all sorts, physical therapy. The problem is those jobs don't pay very well. That's the underlying problem. And we've seen this going on for a long time. So I want to leave you with a final thought, and that is, we've talked about education, we've talked about finance, we've talked about getting big money out of politics, we've talked about a lot of things, but there may be also another frontier here in terms of thinking through where we go in the future. And that is profit sharing, gain sharing, worker ownership, giving average working people a share in the gains from this extraordinary productivity revolution that we see coming. We've got to be creative about that. One more question, and then and this better be a good question, because it's the last one I have. So I don't want to put any pressure on you, but really,
Thank you. No pressure
let
at
me
all. Okay.
summarize everything with a
Yeah,
great
okay.
crescendo.
All right. Well, I'm going to do the best I can. One of the things that I keep wondering, going back to the crux of your talk, which is inequality, is I'm wondering if you can give us your perspective a little bit on which is of more concern, income inequality or wealth inequality, because they're really sort of two separate issues.
They are separate. Thomas Piketty thinks wealth inequality actually is the big problem. In the United States, if you followed my logic, the big issue since the late 70s has not been wealth inequality, it has been income inequality. And income inequality eventually finds its way into wealth inequality, because all that income, particularly at the top, is turned into assets, and those assets generate their own wealth. But for now, the big story, in the United States at least, not other places, I think France, I think Piketty's data is very clear in France and England, the big story here has been income inequality. Which didn't really give me an opportunity to summarize very much. But bear with me, let me summarize just all of this by saying that we are not bystanders. We are not observers. Politics is not a spectator sport. We have an election coming up this fall. We have a presidential election coming up in 2016. I believe that the issues we've been talking about here over the last hour are going to be very central. If you look, for example, at David Bratt and his campaign against Eric Cantor, the Tea Party, the theme in Bratt's campaign was that Cantor was too much of a product of big corporations, of wealth, and also of corruption that money generated. In other words, the Tea Party itself is fomenting on some of the major and central issues we've been talking about today. I don't agree with where they come out, but this is not going away. And if we don't act in a collaborative, nonpartisan way, and if we don't get active and engaged in politics, I'm afraid what we are going to see is a kind of ugly populism that is more divisive than we are at even now. So we need you, we need your engagement and involvement. Thank you very much.